I would just want to introduce to you Tony Ribbink, a dear friend from my stay in South Africa, my second home country. And Tony will talk about the SST and the partnership and some other projects that SST has ongoing on the African continent, and partly also with support from Norway.
Thank you, Carl, and good morning to you and everybody. Carl has asked me to talk to you, and I'm delighted about that, because Carl actually played a really major instrumental role in the development of the African Marine Waste Network project towards zero plastics to the seas of Africa, which I'll be talking about today. And he's asked me to talk about that and SST, that Sustainable Seas Trust partnership with Norway. So really, I'm most honored to be able to do this. So from me and all of SST, a very warm welcome to you. And I consider this to be not only an exciting project, but an essential program. In talking to me, Carl, he's the guy who features again on the left here. He asked me to set the scene, building on what he has provided already, and to illustrate the relationship between Norway and Sustainable Seas Trust, particularly through the African Marine Waste Network program, which is a major program of SST. And the thing that underpins this approach is that the issues are so big that no organization and no country working alone can win the battle against plastics and climate change, and they are actually inextricably linked. And we in South Africa are really proud to have our Norwegian associations, and it's more than just with the Norwegian Department of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, which I'm going to mention in a moment. So in going ahead, I'm going to give a quick glimpse of some of the teasers that underscore the need to exchange ideas, develop an understanding of one another, learn about one another, and open doors to long-term collaborative research and education programs, and importantly, to develop long-term solid friendships. It's really interesting to me that these sorts of programs that we ran decades back, and I can speak in decades, that students and things which we brought together, and indeed my own students, have remained friends, and many of my students and many of my and their colleagues have remained friends, and they are now in decision-making situations, and they're leaders, and by virtue of that, they take the collaboration between countries forward, and that is actually really most rewarding. And this has the opportunity to do the same sort of thing, to make Carl jealous, and to indicate to those of you who haven't been able to come to South Africa, I'm going to show you a little film, thanks to our film unit, of Algoa Bay, Nelson Mandela Bay, where it's beautiful. We have wonderful animals for you to see. Hopefully most of you can identify those. And then you can see floating here on plastic are some people who are really interested in marine life. Occasionally they catch the odd wave as well. And then from there, we're going to take you to see an area which is very close to where you will be stationed, and where we hope that you will go, to show you parts of what we believe would be lovely for you as visitors to South Africa to see. We hope in June that we're going to come across there, and hope that in June you might have some sun instead of your cloud and rain and snow. But we really would love to welcome you, and so sad that you can't do it this time, to our part of South Africa, where we promise not to trip you, but to help you. And we also hope that we'll give you a higher perspective and a better understanding of South Africa. This is a small elephant, a young guy. I think he's hitching a ride. And while in South Africa, you'll be exposed to South African hospitality, and we hope that in Norway, we will see a different sky when we visit there. Right, so Carl, I hope you're suitably jealous. But those are places that you have been, Carl. So while the problems in Norway and South Africa may be the same in name, they are very different in reality. Our cultures, our societies, our circumstances are so different that it's almost certain that the way in which we in Africa need to solve problems will not work as easily in Norway. And equally, what you in Norway do and what's important to you are going to need to be modified when you come to South Africa and deal with others in Africa. And what will be really important in these exchanges is to better understand the cultural and circumstantial differences that we find in one and the other countries. Now, I've chosen examples from the African Marine Waste Network program, which has a title. This particular program is funded by the Norwegian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. It has the title of Towards Zero Plastics to the Seas of Africa, which is also the theme and the main objective of the African Marine Waste Network as a whole. This project, as indicated here, is funded primarily by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Norway. And in Norway, Sustainable Seas Trust also works with NTNU, and this partnership that we have here with Scarlett at NTNU is one example of that. And another is that on the microplastics toxicity, we are also working with NTNU, and we have a partnership with Grid Arendal, not principally at the moment in terms of filmmaking. I'm going to talk today about the value and role and impact of research, and the same for education, economic approaches, and then that of networking and getting together. And collectively, these all contribute to what is being called for by United Nations Environmental Assembly. We need to develop national and regional action plans that will contribute to policy development and change. So these are all really important issues. It's interesting that as far as research is concerned, many people in industry, civil society, and the media say the problems are so big and urgent, we know enough, it's time to abandon research, get out there and get things done. This get things done actually was the approach that Boris Johnson took for Brexit, and it doesn't seem to be working that well. Needed more research. Right, I think that they have a point when they criticize research, because in a way, things are really urgent and we do need to get things done. But blind action is actually unrealistic, and it could even be counterproductive. Again, Boris Johnson and Brexit. I think that research and action need to be interlinked, and this is actually going to be part of the theme of what we discuss as we go forward today. Now, it's important to realize that research provides the knowledge and the data that steers action. And I think a very good example actually is have a look at those nations in controlling this pandemic that didn't base their strategies and their actions on well-founded science and on evidence-based decisions. They are not doing nearly as well as those countries that actually used science to guide the way forward. When we call upon decision makers to develop a strategy, to develop policies, it's science and research that they need to use as evidence to support their policies. So really, action and research must go hand in hand. And in many cases, and possibly all cases, they probably need to be concurrent. So I guess the issue is, what's the point of taking action if you're not able to determine whether what you did was effective and had an impact, and if you're unsure that the impact and actions taken would actually lead you to achieve your goals? So what is it that we need then to look at? The obvious starting point is we need to know, where are we now? Where do we want to go? And how do we get there? So where are we now provides the measurable baseline. Where do we want to be? That sets the target and the vision. And how do we get there? That defines the actions plans that you need to put in place, or the strategy to go forwards. So in essence, from the towards zero plastic to the seas of Africa, given that the plastics principally come from land, we want to change from the picture on the left to the picture on the right, everywhere. Okay, so that means that we need to have a measurable baseline. And the measurable baseline means that we have the basis against which to compare or to see what we have done and the progress towards our goal of where we want to be. In Africa, as I indicated, we at the African Marine Waste Network, we wish to take the continent and island states, and yes, we do have the mandate for the 54 continental and island states of the African group towards zero plastics to the seas. So we need to know then how much plastics is flowing into the seas, where it is coming from, and what its impact is on the environment. And we therefore need to also develop a strategy. And the strategy needs to say, well, where is it coming from? What are the sources? And the two principal sources, there's the new plastics that are being used and discarded into the environment, as Carl says, many of them are single-use plastics. And we also need to deal with plastics that are already in the environment. So that means that we have to have two strategies. The first requires that at every step of the value chain, we need to make changes that can at least prepare the plastics to be better recycled or to go into some profitable end market in one way or another. And the other is to stop everybody from adding unmanaged plastics to the natural environment, from their homes, from their offices, from their schools, from their campuses, recreational areas, and so forth. So that is the way that we need to look at stopping new plastics coming into the environment. The other is to encourage everybody to clean that which is already in the environment. That is probably a little easier to achieve through cleanups and so forth. So one of the things that I really love about our major program, which is driving this, which is called Operation Clean Spot, is here in the bottom right-hand corner. The team is actually persuading people that the sea starts in your office, in your home, in your school. It starts here. Because the essence of that is that plastics which are discarded anywhere, even inland cities, start their journey to the sea as they're washed down the catchments, or they're blown down the catchments into the streams and rivers and make their way to the sea, ultimately through estuaries, or in Norway, through the fjords, to the sea and onto the beaches, into the oceans and so forth. So if people can realize that the impact on the sea starts where they are working, living, playing, then that is a step forward and they'll take it more seriously. So I think that's a great start. Right. I jumped ahead of myself a little bit there. Okay, so persuading people not to litter and to clean is not so easy. It requires understanding of the plastic litter, where the debris enters the environment, and all of these things are aspects that we're working on, and we'd love to share with all of you as the ideas come in. And this, I think, we're going to deal with a little further, a little later on. I just want to pause now for a moment on the research that we've been discussing. One of the most important aspects, and a sub-project that is led by Toshka Bernardo and Danny Marlin, is that the need to develop, as we discussed before, baselines. And they're developing techniques in their team for measuring plastic loads on land, in the waterways, along the shorelines, including beaches. And they've developed and published the African Marine Litter Monitoring Manual. Now, this is a really important development, because what one needs is to have data that are comparable. And by developing these techniques and sharing it, one is able then to ensure, as we are doing, that different teams in different countries are collecting data in the same way that's going to be comparable. And what Danny and Toshka and their teams have been doing is working with a number of different countries so that these countries here on the right, mainly Western Indian Ocean countries, they are concurrently with the work that we're doing in South Africa here, they're doing the similar sorts of things. And it means that the Western Indian Ocean countries, this East Africa and the offshore islands are the western part of the Indian Ocean and hence the Western Indian Ocean, they are working together to get regional baselines, looking at the differences within countries, sharing ideas. And these same techniques through our association with the Abidjan Convention are now being considered in these countries as well. And so the great value of this is the collaboration that is taking place and uniformity and the comparable way in which data are being collected. And this is, in fact, a great achievement. Right. And so what does this all mean? Well, if we, in fact, have litter monitoring, and we can therefore develop a baseline. Once we know what is actually happening in terms of a baseline, we can develop a strategy for the types of interventions that are necessary to take us forward. This is the sort of action that is now going to be based and pinned on research. And if it is successful, then we'll find that the plastics and so forth on land, in the catchment, in the rivers, in the fjords, in the estuaries, actually declines, and the same would apply to what goes to the beaches and out to sea. And that would be a successful strategy, which would then contribute to meeting SDG goals and reduce marine litter. And on the other hand, if the evaluations show that our strategy is not being successful, then we've got to go back in an adaptive management aspect and improve it. But we cannot do this without the research and the baselines and the monitoring that science brings to the table. So to those who say, get on with the action, don't worry about research, I say, no, they must go together hand in hand. Righto, I want to just show you a couple of little extra bits of the type of research that we do. Here's a beach that you will be visiting when you come here. Unfortunately, we hope that you won't see this. And these are some of the SST team working. They're a little bit in slow motion. I can assure that SST works faster than this. One of the problems of doing research is that these days people are cleaning the beaches. That should really not be allowed. And so they influence our results. And the type of research that Toshka and her team does is they actually do accumulative surveys in which they see what accumulates over 10 days. They do a basic cleanup, and then over the next 10 days, they clean up to find out what is actually accumulated on each successive day. If others come along and they clean because they are driven by society or something to do it, they feel good about it, it does actually create a problem. The next is a movie showing some of the other parts. Here, we're showing an aspect of microplastic research. Now, in Africa, as opposed to Norway, the emphasis should be really on macroplastics, because if one stops the macroplastics, then by default, meso and microplastics will also reduce. And it's cost effective to work on macroplastics, and one gets a better return on that. However, it is valuable to indicate to people that microplastics do adsorb and absorb toxins and heavy metals and other things, and that they accumulate and biomagnify and may come back to affect the people. We also do drone research, and this is led by Sean, who does maps and mapping to give the public an understanding. And here are the cleanups within the street areas, in the catchments, and so forth. All of these provided and recorded in the data as we move Nelson Mandela Bay municipality, Port Elizabeth, towards zero plastics to the seas. Before I leave the research quickly, Kylie Harris has developed a mobile app and called Litter Logger. And it's great because it links electronically and provides the data that is within, which follows the data sheets within the manual. And also it acts in terms of encouraging citizen scientists to assist. And they, of course, are really responsive to these because particularly young people love to be involved in projects that are important, that they can see, they can determine the changes. And so Sean's maps come in as well, because we like to show people the progress that's being made in the cities towards zero plastics. But Kylie's app is in fact great. It has African attributes. It's geared to Africa. It's geared to our manual. It's geared to what we do. So a great job there. Okay, now let's talk about the role of education. It is interesting that at the last, in fact, the first international conference of the African Marine Waste Network, the experts were asked to say, what are the most important, and to tell us, what are the most important steps that need to be taken in Africa? And what came out really near the top, other than data, was education. Education, capacity building, skills development. They're really not available, and it's just not present, and it's not a strength of Africa. And if people don't understand the issues related to plastics, they're not in a good position then to react to them as they should. So the research that SST undertook, and note, research is not just scientific research. Research also takes place in the education, in the economics, throughout. The research underpins this, and we found that in Africa, the majority of countries do not have plastics as part of their curricula. Therefore, the teachers do not need to know about the issues of plastics, and they don't teach it. Therefore, the capacity to teach about plastics is not there, and the knowledge that one needs to have to react to plastics isn't there. And so the education team is developing with 25 experts, principally from Africa, but not entirely from Africa. They're developing the education resource book, which is going to be, I like the literary manual, it's going to be a source for schools. It's going to have, for schools curricula, it's going to have multiple modules as well, which can serve municipalities, business, and so forth, and set standards. It's been interesting also in part of our research that even though education isn't formally taught in most places at the level it should, and it's in very few universities as well, many enthusiastic people in NGOs and other education centers do teach aspects of education. Some of them do a great job, but far too many of them are teaching incorrectly, and we say they're teaching rubbish about rubbish. The issue is, just like in having standards and a uniform way of developing data in science, we need to have education that is not based on misperceptions, education that has the standards and is able to provide the needs and meet the needs in getting people well informed of where to go. Now, the African Waste Academy is in a way an e-learning opportunity, and it's able to download. We want to develop downloadable educational materials. We want to have interactive content, accredited courses, and we're working towards, as Antara, who's hosting this meeting, is also runs the forums and so forth, and it leads and runs young leader and expert exchanges. And this SANO meeting that we have now is one of the leaders and expert exchange programs, which is in fact absolutely in line with the African Waste Academy. And the other thing is to run webinars which Tara and her team send out into Africa. So this is another example of sharing and penetrating and getting the information out. And then, as Carl is going to tell you a bit more tomorrow, Africa and the youth in Africa are phenomenally powerful. Firstly, they have the vigor, the enthusiasm, it's their future. They have the desire to be part of their future. In Africa, it's the youngest continent in terms of the age group, and by 2050, the youth will in fact be by far the dominant, and actually as we move towards the end of the century, there'll be more youth in Africa than then more than 50% of the youth in the world will be on the African continent. The launch of the African Youth Network also shows another tie between Norway and South Africa. It's a Norwegian minister, Minister Nebo, she's the young lady in the middle, Minister Hanekom, who's at that stage Minister of Tourism and standing in for Minister of Environment Affairs, and the youth in front of them. So this is a very powerful thing. It's being grown by a lovely team now, and we think that the future is going to lie in this. And they too need to be having the most basic information and accuracy in terms of the educational content and where they go. But it's a fun part. Here is a quick video of the education team and it's adult education here. This is Karine. The previous person was Nozi. This is Karine with some youth. And this is so rewarding. Here is Alexi, who was the person who launched the African Youth Waste Network. Nozi again with a team of people. And here's Philippa in a classroom situation. And this is a fun aspect, and Karine again. The fun aspect was Munch, a wire coelacanth. And now moving on to the role and impact of economic approaches. If we are going to take Africa to zero plastics to the seas, it's really important to recognize the role of economics. We in Africa live in a very littered environment, and yet only 4% on average of plastics is recycled in Africa, according to the African Waste Management Outlook, which is basically the most accurate indication that we have. And that's set against the global average of 20%. So one's got to ask, well, why is this? And yet some parts of Africa, including South Africa, are quite successful, where 11 to 12% are recycled, which suggests then that many countries are not recycling at all. And the question then, why is this? And to some extent, it means that people are not seeing waste, and it's called waste blindness. But really, it's because there's no incentive to pick up the waste. Why should you pick up plastics if you're not going to get a reward for it? And the incentive that is required is that there needs to be an enterprise. If there's no market and no buyer, why bother to pick up the plastics in Africa? So therefore, in the majority of countries, we find that there's only 4% recycling, and some countries have zero. There's no incentive at all in a rewarding sense to pick up the plastics. In South Africa, Kenya, and others, we do have people who retrieve plastic, waste retrievers or waste collectors or waste pickers, and there are 60 to 90,000. Though Stein is talking after me, can probably give more accurate figures. And they perform a huge service, and they save the country millions annually, and they're rewarded very little, but nevertheless, it provides an income. And then jobs are also created by the recycling factories and so forth. But these waste pickers or retrievers are also vulnerable to fluctuations in the oil price. and the global economics, like recently affected by COVID. So they sometimes might find themselves out of a job, because if it is better for a factory to take virgin oil products, oil-based products, than to take recycled plastics, then of course the price of recycled plastics drops. Now, Norway also doesn't recycle very much, but it exports, which is wise and possibly more cost effective, given that it's got a small population. It might not have the volumes that are necessary. I want to show you now a small film on the waste pickers.
It's not a nice job, honestly, to scratch rubbish from someone's bin, but because of the situation and the condition where you are, there's nothing else you can pick up. Rather than going to wait for you, come with camera, then I just grab it and run, or what you see. 1, 2, 3, they are losing jobs in SABC, 1,000 what permanent, they are losing jobs, what. People who are qualified, you see now, what about you? So, yeah, even when we pick up stuff now, you see we lost a lot of branches. Because restaurants, they are not operating the way the Monte Casino, the way people used to be too much, you get cans, they are not operating, people are not drinking. No more those cans for beer or empty bottles for beer, you can go and sell it. So since Corona started, the prices are down.
Like looking at this bag here, it must be full at least for us to get something, If you're looking at maybe about 60 kgs, then we're looking at about maybe 120 Rand to almost 200 Rand, yeah.
Because those things, you scale them differently. Like those bottles for cold drink is like 2 Rand 10 cents per kilo. Those cans that you drink for cold drink is 11 Rand now. And then for milk is HD, that one. It's 2 Rand 80. Polyprop is containers and what and buckets and what. It's 280 also, is down.
People are not buying a lot of cold drinks, and bottles are not so many like how we used to always get them, especially like festive times. That's the times where we collect more of these bottles.
Seriously, and recycling is like the best way to get money easily, because most of the things that you use in the house is recyclable.
Right. So the issue then is that if one doesn't have the enterprises that take the plastics and produce products that have a marketable value, one is unlikely then to be able to sell the plastics and have a product. And that means that pushing the circular economy, which in principle and theory works very well in Europe, and in practice it also works quite well in Europe, becomes much more challenging in Africa. And clearly what we need is enterprises. But when one has factories of this nature, and we have some in South Africa, this is in South Africa, that's a huge, huge investment. And the country has to have the volumes of plastic to make it worthwhile. If you do not have those volumes of plastics, then one cannot get a return on the investment of building major capital. So what we need to do in Africa is look at smaller enterprises. And Nicole and her team are responsible for the development of incentives and enterprises. The emphasis has to be on developing small-scale enterprises, and in some countries there can be large-scale enterprises where the investment can be made and the returns are likely to be good. And so the real emphasis must be on enterprise development to provide the incentives, to provide the end market, and to produce goods that are of value. And one thinks very often here of building blocks, of floor tiles, of roof tiles, of even through pyrolysis, taking plastics to fuel, back to fuel, because it is an oil product and it can actually be returned certainly to diesel. Right, so the other really important point, and this is my final point, is that the communications, the films, the networking, and so forth, is enormously important for us to reach all the countries that we are working with, and for them to, in fact, feel part of what we are doing. And so the web page, the films, the illustrations are very, very valuable. We need to be conscious and respect the different cultures, the different circumstances, the different languages, and hence using films and illustrations become really important. But probably the greatest value that we can have is to network. And to network, we are doing this very strongly. To network, the best way to network is to bring people so that they can together, so that they can meet face to face, develop friendships. And the African Marine West Network Conference, the second one, is going to be next year, from the 25th to the 29th of April. And we are looking forward to having a report on the SANO. And ideally, it would be good to have some of you, hopefully most of you, deliver talks on your work, your collaborative work as we go forwards. So my many thanks to you and to our sponsors, and particularly here to the Norwegian Retailers Environment Fund, who've put the SANO program together, and to Carl for funding it, also not to Carl for finding the funds for it. So many thanks to all of you, and have a good day.
Thank you very much, Tony. There is a question in the chat from Gregor. Hi, Tony. You were mentioning that addressing primarily the microplastics issue might be an effective or the most effective way of reducing the amount of meso and macroplastics on the other hand. Could you elaborate on that?
No, it's the other way around. If one addresses macroplastics, then it follows that they will not break down to mesoplastics and to microplastics. So in other words, if we took macroplastics out of the environment, then they would not break down, and they would not therefore occur as much in the environment as they did before. And the issue is, where do we focus attention and funds and investment in Africa? Given that our huge problem is the plastics that you've seen lying around all over Africa, then we cannot afford to spend our limited resources, unless funded by somebody else, on, for example, microplastic studies, or to any major extent trying to get rid of mesoplastics. We do need basic information on this, and we do need knowledge, and we do need to track it. But the major effort should be going into macroplastics. And it's just cost effective. I do think, for example, that in Norway, you can afford to have a greater research endeavor and give a greater focus to microplastics, because your problem is not so much macroplastics, because that is better handled than we can do in Africa. In Africa, the first steps are macroplastics. It's macroplastics that we can see in the environment. It's macroplastics that we clean up in the environment. It's macroplastics that are going to move it from littered to unlittered. It's going to give us the rewards, the incentive to move further afield. So if you tie up the macroplastics, it follows that mesoplastics and microplastics will decrease. And the work that we're doing on microplastics is focused really on the toxicity and human health issues, rather than microplastics in general, though we do have colleagues who are working on this, and we may extend, but our focus is on macroplastics. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you so much, Tony. This is very insightful, and it also illustrates the differences between our two countries and the various challenges. I just want to add a quick comment that when you travel the islands of the Norwegian coast out toward the North Sea, the amount of macroplastics and fish nets and the likes at the outer islands, the side facing the storms, is just totally amazing. And you find carcasses of sheep and other animals who get entangled in the plastic. So just to illustrate that the challenges are very different, but the root causes of it is something we all need to be looking at.